Hey creeps, it's Horror Free for All. So, I'm here today to talk about Creepshow, and for once in a little while, I should say, I'm actually excited to talk about it. Because this past September in 2025, we got news that the Creepshow television show was canceled. And I was really pissed, like a lot of Creepshow fans out there. And I had a negative taste in my mouth, thinking that the comics are pretty much going to be the last leg of the franchise. We're not going to get this proposed video game that's been in limbo for years. And the franchise is just going to fizzle out and be forgotten. Until my hope was reinvigorated by a good friend of mine, which I'm not going to expose in this video because I trust in their confidentiality. But this individual approached me with information that they were in contact with another individual who got to meet Greg Nicotero in person. Now, I know this is word of mouth, but the individual that got to meet Greg Nicotero is a big YouTuber in this community that I wholeheartedly trust. And supposedly this person asked Greg Nicotero to their face, is Creepshow going to continue? And Nicotero essentially told him, absolutely, but in movies. So armed with that information, I thought I'd get on camera now and share stories that future Creepshow movies should adapt. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm an impassioned Creepshow fan. I'm a lifelong fan. I've been reading weird literature, weird fiction, comic book horror, you name it, pretty much my whole life. If we're talking just comic book horror stories that I've read, I would say I've read pushing a couple of thousand. Talking short stories in literature of weird fiction, I've read pushing 1,000, if not over that. So I've come across a lot of stories in my time. Because I'm a massive Creepshow fan, I understand that the original 1982 movie and the sequel from 1987 was pretty much a mix of original stories written for the movies and adapted stories. I think there's room for original stories being written for movies, and that's not what this video is to try to sway away from. No, I have utmost faith that if there are stories being written for these hypothetical Creepshow movies, that the people involved would see the cinematic relevance to bring it to the big screen enough to have the confidence to make it. The issue is picking stories that I think are pretty much packaged ready to go for the most part, that completely feel like a comic book, whether they are proud short fiction or actual comic stories themselves, being brought to the big screen that fans would love. But most importantly is that they execute the ideal Creepshow story already. Now, to me, a Creepshow story is a mixture of three things. One, the first and foremost thing you need to have in Creepshow is you need to have that EC Comics feel. That's the main ingredient. The storytelling. Having a story that plays out like a comic book story is really important in Creepshow. And I think the most recent iteration of the IP, the TV show, had gotten it down for the most part pretty pat. But there were some episodes that kind of delved into, we're not really feeling like comics right now. You know? These stories will kind of bring the focus back for the films. Especially if this is supposed to bring the Creepshow films back from the dead after Creepshow 3. I think it's really important that the storytelling feels like an EC comic as well. So, with that being said, I have 12 stories to talk about. They all have different origin points of why they're on this list, but in their own merits as stories, I think they would be fun inclusions into this franchise, which, quite honestly, is one of the most bonkers fucking franchises I think out there in horror. I mean, from the franchise's roots, pretty much beginning as a Stephen King vehicle to adapt some of his stories, to then evolving over time, especially in modern times, into becoming like a springboard to invite other franchises to kind of be married into it. Like, we have Evil Dead Deadites in the TV show. We have Night of the Living Dead pretty much canonized in the TV show. There's a old 60s horror movie called The Horror Express that basically got christened as a Creepshow movie unofficially because of the TV show. And I feel like the future of these films coming back from the dead after Creepshow 3, if we're going to call this Creepshow 4 or Creepshow Reborn, please don't name it something like that. I'd rather Creepshow 4 if anything. But producers, if you're watching, if we're going into a fourth Creepshow movie, I feel like there's an opportunity to hit a sweet spot with a few things like the amount of stories per movie is the first and foremost important thing, to get that pacing right for each movie. The type of stories you're doing, kind of mixing them up to make it feel a little bit different than the previous story, and also to have more grander stories and some more straightforward stories to help balance out the runtime and the budget, I guess, for you. And then, of course, making room for that wraparound that Creepshow was known for in each movie. So the wraparound can be standout and different from the movies before it and the movies after it. You know, I totally get people's criticisms with the first Creepshow movie being 5 segments is too long. And I think the original movie ends right at 2 hours. I have to agree. I think 2 hours is a bit too long, you know? But I also feel like Creepshow 2 being 3 segments is too short. So I think the happy medium for future Creepshow movies is 4 segments a movie and a wraparound. That should probably put the movie roughly around 100 minutes for each one, roughly, give or take. Depends on the stories you're picking to do. And by all means, even if like 1 to 3 of these stories on this list get picked to be in these movies, and the producers somehow find this video and watch it, I'd be happy. So I'm not saying that all of these need to be picked to be in movies. I'm just saying that I'm providing you, theoretically, with 3 movies worth of content. The only thing you have to do with certain stories that aren't public domain, yes, there are public domain stories in here, believe it or not, is secure the rights for them and make them. That's all you need to do. I feel like we're going to start talking about this first hypothetical movie, I guess a Creepshow 4. Consider these first 4 segments good to go for a movie here. 3 out of the 4 actually come from an unmade movie called Tales from the Dark Side 2. Yes, I've talked about these stories in the past on my previous channel, and I feel like I'm a broken record, but we might as well get into it. The first story is a public domain story now, I believe. It's written by Robert Bloch, and this was a story handpicked by George Romero to be in Tales from the Dark Side 2 that never happened, like its other 2 stories that were going to be with it. Supposedly it was because, even though Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, made money, I guess the studio pulled the plug and the movie just never happened. So the George Romero connection is why these 3 stories are on here. All right, this is for the fans, the deep cut fans, to start off with these 3. I think if you did that, producers, people would be 100% on board moving forward. So, getting back to the story, the first story is Almost Human by Robert Bloch. Now, on the surface, this story is about a con man and his accomplice essentially conning their way into the home of an inventor who has created this sentient robot that has the ability to learn human emotion and behavioral patterns. Through the accomplice being able to break the mold, the con man essentially comes in at gunpoint and decides to take the robot for himself and start corrupting it with bad behavior. Then, of course, coming at the accosting of the inventor losing his life, the con man and his accomplice, along with the robot, make out of the inventor's home and attempt to go on a spree of crime, of which the con men are going to blame the robot for. But unknowingly to the con men, the robot has picked up on the behavior and has started to develop emotions that they weren't accounting for. Perhaps it has to deal with love. And we see some grisly comeuppance come at the expense of the conmen because of this. This story was picked by George Romero to be in Tales from the Dark Side 2. However, I really feel that in the heart of it, it's still a Creepshow story. Robert Bloch is a fantastic writer. His repertoire of short stories getting adapted in George Romero projects is pretty extensive, actually. And out of all the stories that got adapted, I think my favorite one was Mannequins of Horror from Monsters. Now, this has potential to be great, especially if they go for the comic book blowout effects of like the robot doing his thing, especially when you get to the climax of the story, which I'm not going to give away in this video, but that would be absolutely fantastic. And the stinger ending, ending with that comic panel shot that the movies are known for, would be jaw-dropping to a lot of folks, especially if you're unacquainted with Almost Human's story. Number 2 is also related to Tales from the Dark Side 2, but it's also related to Creepshow 2. This story was written by George Romero and Stephen King, initially to be put into Creepshow 2. Now, if you have the Arrow Video 4K or Blu-ray box set, including Pinfall Comic, which, spoiler alert, is the title of the second story, Pinfall. It blows my mind that Pinfall got sidelined for Creepshow 2 and sidelined for Tales from the Dark Side 1 and was just going to be made in Tales from the Dark Side 2 but never happened. But upon reading it, I understand why. This is a bigger scope than usual story than you find in Creepshow, which I think is a perfect jumping off point, kind of like Almost Human in some ways, to be more expansive while still being easy to follow. So the basic premise behind Pinfall is you have these two rival bowling teams who pretty much hate each other's guts, are entering a competition against each other when an elderly gentleman who has a lot of money tragically dies in a graphic way at their local bowling alley. And in his will, he wanted to bequeath a huge sum of money in a bowling tournament that these teams could enter to give back to the bowling community that he loved so much during his time living. And as you'll find out in the story, one team starts to figure out that the other team is pretty much going to beat them fair and square. And they get very antsy about going into the competition fairly. So they decide to take it upon themselves to try to sabotage the other bowling team. But it tragically backfires, and the massive consequences that result from that comes in huge life loss via undead comeuppance. It is a schlocky, over-the-top story. It is pretty much a Tales from the Crypt episode realized into a Creepshow segment. If you wanted to pick a Tales from the Crypt-like story to put into Creepshow, pretty much down to the T, that doesn't really have many Creepshow calling cards, it is this one. Yeah, you have your typical notes of revenge. Revenge is earned. Asshole comeuppance. They get what they deserve. That's basically all this story is. But it also has some mild commentary about fair play and, being ethical in sports. So at least you have something else to chew on besides that. But I think this would be a very entertaining story. And last but not least, with the final of the 3 Tales from the Dark Side 2 stories, we have a story by Stephen King that over the years people have been shocked has never been turned into anything. And I think it's because of how weird the story is and what it would require that has put people off from wanting to make it. But surprisingly, George Romero was willing to make it. And the story is called Rainy Season. Now, Rainy Season is a story about a newlywed couple on their honeymoon going up to a secluded mountainside town, I think in Maine somewhere. And they encounter some locals that essentially tell them that there's a superstition, or I guess a semi-annual event that happens every few years or so, where fanged toads or frogs fall out of the sky and they viciously kill for one night. And that, I guess, quenches their thirst enough to go away for a little while. And it's said that it happens every so often. I forget the exact amount of time, but newlywed couple kind of laughs that off at first, but then one of the couple decides that there could be some merit and some truth behind it, and the other one is still dismissive. And once the phenomenon starts happening, you see these two kind of divulge being newlyweds and being freshly, I guess, acquainted and living with each other, the gravity of the situation of marriage, as they both have different worldviews and outlooks on how to handle things, and these personalities start clashing as this pretty much cataclysmic natural disaster is happening to them. And I guess they have to work through their differences, or I guess succumb to their differences and accept that maybe they don't work as well together. And you see the result of the story accompanied with that. Now, this is more of a character study of a story, I feel, than an actual horror story. And I think the real challenge for people making this story, of course, is the raining frog aspect to it. But all you really need to do to compensate that, especially nowadays with technology, is CGI, the toads falling out, and then have some practical ones roaming around the house or wherever where the couple is fighting them off. Yes. The story does have an ironic ending in the short story. And I think if you kept that ending, it would have that old Chief Woodenhead vibe of an ending that I think people would really like. So you should keep that. Basically, the story writes itself. You don't really need to change much here. All right. Moving on to story number 4. Now we're starting to venture outside of Tales from the Dark Side 2. And to round out this first hypothetical Creepshow 4, we have a story written by a woman named Nancy A. Collins. And this story is actually a part of a franchise that Nancy A. Collins has written called Sonya Blue. Sonya Blue is a character. She is essentially a punk anti-hero vampire character akin to something like Marvel's Blade. And there's a short story out there that I have found from this collection that feels so standalone-ish that you kind of forget that it's associated with the Sonya Blue series. And because we've had, like I said, the Horror Express christened into the franchise, Night of the Living Dead, Evil Dead Deadites, why not enshrine Sonya Blue into the Creepshow franchise and bring in this story called The Real Thing? Now, The Real Thing is one of my favorite comic stories ever made. Yes, this is a comic story associated with the world of Sonya Blue. And the story is essentially about a punk vampire girl who hates her own kind, who resents her own identity, and wants to help save humanity and rid the world of the atrocities that vampires do just by their mere existence, has stumbled across a band of individuals who are posing as real vampires. And she takes it upon herself to kind of listen in and observe what they're talking about. And she quickly realizes that these people are basically full of shit. And she goes to try to scare some sense into these kids. But one is just so far gone in their fantasy and their creepy desire to want to become evil incarnate that the vampire must make a choice. And with that comes a very grisly ending and reinforcement that she's doing the right thing. Yeah, this story is super straightforward. It's a very straightforward story, but what makes this one fun is the character dynamics that you would find with the characters, I feel. And the fact that, Creepshow doesn't really do this often, but I think having like a pseudo superhero or anti-hero character in the franchise is something I've always kind of wanted. And I feel like Sonya Blue is like a really good example of a character that could work in the franchise. I'm not saying that you need to reuse her and have a bunch of sequels or anything. I'm just saying that this is a really fun standalone, like superhero-esque story. Like it feels like like a Blade comic book story that Blade would go through, right? Similar character traits and characteristics there, where the anti-heroes, they're vampires themselves or half-breeds, and they want to get rid of the vampires to help save humans because they value that part of their past or their identity more than their vampire counterparts. And of course, we go into the backstory here of how this woman became a vampire, and we go into the backstory of why these people want to become vampires. And I think that's kind of interesting to kind of make a balancing point and make people think about, idolism, maybe having false idols, wanting the bad things in life over the good things, you know what I mean? And I think because of that, it would pair very well with these other three stories to round out this first hypothetical Creepshow 4. Moving on to the hypothetical Creepshow 5. Now, this is a grab bag of sorts. Some of these I've recommended in the past. Some of these are new stories that I haven't talked about yet. The first one is actually a story from a good friend of mine known as the Horrorlander. Originally, before Creepshow, the television show, got canceled, I was going to do a third installment of stories that Creepshow should adapt in the television series. And he had recommended this story in that video, which was going to be a collab, called In the Bag by Tim Curry. And I have since read that story, and I've read it now twice, and I absolutely love it, and I think he was right on the money by saying that this was a Creepshow story, because it 100% feels like it would be. The basic premise of this one is a derelict Santa Claus who goes to like this rundown church on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, I forget the exact details, finds this creature hanging from the rafters of the church that resembles Santa's sash, the sack that he carries the presents with. And he decides to go out and give back to the community the best way he knows how. And the best way he knows how involves the sack doing its cleanup of the folks who are suffering out there in the cold on Christmas with nothing to show for it. Yes, this comes to commentate pretty blatantly on the right and wrongs of how to handle the homeless, the sick and dying, right? It's basically a play on euthanasia. It's a thought-provoking story. It's super schlocky. The monster is super unique. And it's very festive. It's riddled with atmosphere. You might not have heard of Tim Curran before, but Tim Curran, like Nancy Collins, Robert Bloch, Stephen King, George Romero, he loves comic books. He loves comic book horror. The stuff that I've read from him personally, you can tell that he grew up reading this medium, and he's trying to evolve it to what he thinks is cool. I trust this guy making more content that feels like this in nature. But what I'm more after is, with Creepshow, you have that layer element in the stories where in the underbelly it's talking about something bigger than what you're seeing on screen when you peel back the story itself. And this is riddled with that, ripe with thought-provoking stuff. And I think people would really enjoy this one. Number 6 is a story by Joe Hill. And it's my absolute favorite story by Joe Hill, actually. I've wanted this one adapted for years. I think it's a grander scale story, given how large the budget would have to be to make this happen. But, if they're only putting 4 segments in a movie, you can really hone in the budget for this one. It's Dark Carousel. Who doesn't love this story if you haven't read it before? This story is about 4, later age, and maybe in early college years, teenagers are having one last final hurrah at this local carnival that has this urban legend-esque carousel that operates in there. And there's an operator that acts super weird when the kids are there to ride the ride. And given the backstory and everything involved with it, there's a certain altercation that happens with the ride operator. And because of this altercation, the teens feel like they need to get out and try to hide out for a little while, and then try to come back and, clean up the evidence, so to speak, with that. The carousel horses have come to life and are seeking vengeance for their operator / owner's death. And in glorious fashion, you see that happen one by one to these characters. And then the last one remaining has something arguably even more grislier happen to them. I'll just leave it there. Obviously up front, you have carousel horses coming to life. This sounds like a big budget story, and admittedly it is. But in a movie setting, I think what will really be the selling point for this story is the characters. Especially if you have time to go into the character building that the short story does, and maybe give this one a longer length than some of the other segments in the movie, you can really flesh this one out. And I think this will be a fan favorite one. Just with the carnival atmosphere alone, if you're able to nail that, this story it plays for itself. I think you would have an absolute hit on your hands and a fan favorite story. Number 7. This is a story that I recently have found because I discovered that one of my favorite horror directors, who I find extremely underrated, wrote short fiction. And I found this story in a collection of Western horror stories. Yes, horror stories with a Western backdrop, like, outlaws, gunslingers. And the story is written by Eric Red, who, if you're not familiar with my channel, I've watched quite a few of his movies. He tends to direct movies that really feel like a Tales from the Crypt movie brought to life. He understands comics. He understands that medium. And this story, quite literally, is a play on a very popular Tales from the Crypt segment and comic story called Carrion Death. And the story is called The Buzzard. So with that title, you're probably like, oh, okay, Carrion Death. That story had a killer vulture stalking an escaped prisoner that's handcuffed to a cop. Here, it's a giant buzzard vulture thing, but the buzzard vulture is more Roadrunner-esque than the Tales from the Crypt counterpart to the main character's Wile E. Coyote. You know what I mean? This is 100% a Wile E. Coyote versus Roadrunner story, and it's super entertaining. It's about a gunslinger who's an outlaw running from the law. He has plenty of weapons in tow. He has a notorious reputation, but his past is starting to come back to bite him because he's gotten wounded pretty bad. And because he's been wounded, he's attracted this, I guess he's left a scent for this humongous buzzard that looks decrepit already, might be undead, might be supernatural, might be the spirit animal of, North American past, who knows? It's very ambiguous in the story. But whatever happens to get this buzzard attention doesn't really matter in the story as much as this gunslinger has been targeted by this thing. And the whole story is essentially various run-ins with him trying to kill the buzzard and him thinking that he killed the buzzard, then waking up, finding that, it's killed his horse. Now he has to run on foot. The buzzard starts to look more decrepit. He has bullet holes showing, his eyes is popping out, stuff like that. Stuff crazy, crazy visuals, right? And it ends up on a note where you can kind of see where it's going, but it's super humorous. It's enjoyable. And the punchline, like I said, makes it worth the price of admission alone. This story, I think, would be a shoo-in for Creepshow to adapt. Yeah, Tales from the Crypt did it first, but this is Creepshow's take on it. Look, if you want to be really technical, Father's Day ripped off Tales from the Crypt. There's many stories that ripped off. Even Marvel comics, like a story, Something That Tied You Over, basically was a very popular and famous Bronze Age Marvel comic story. So for being technical here, the buzzard getting made, no harm, no foul to me. And plus, I want to see an Eric Red story get made. moving on from that, the last story in Creepshow 5, I guess to call it here, is a public domain story. And this story is written by a fellow named Theodore Sturgeon. I've talked about this story in the past. I think that if you fix the narrative style of this story to be like my favorite Tales from the Crypt episode of all time, Dig That Cat, He's Real Gone, it would literally come across as Creepshow's take on that. But it also, now thinking on it, feels like my favorite Night Gallery episode called A Question of Fear. And if you've seen A Question of Fear from Night Gallery and you know the general setup, imagine A Quest of Fear and Dig That Cat, He's Real Gone put into a blender. Then you get this story called Shadow Bob. Now, how I would frame it, now this is very important. If you're out there, producers, and you're listening to my recommendations, what's very important is that you take the Dig That Cat, He's Real Gone approach by beginning the story with the main character inside of this haunted house, and he's in a darkly lit room telling the audience, hey, I see ghosts. Ghosts can't see me, explaining his power, going into the backstory of his, prior working life, how he finds this random shop called the Shadow Bob, how he's essentially poisoned and given this curse to where ghosts can't see him anymore, but now all he sees is ghosts. He makes a side business, like basically being like a psychic medium, talking to dead people for customers, making a living off that, and then finding some of his former coworker friends that were pretty much bullies to him and daring them to go stay the night in a haunted house to prove that he actually does have this real talent that they don't believe in. And once we get caught up to speed there, we get basically the unfolding climax of the story. And then the ending comes once we get caught up to speed with the main character catching us up to speed up to that point where we get the iconic twist to the story. And the twist, I don't want to spoil, but all I'm going to say is the haunted house has a creepy backstory about a certain ghost that possibly is haunting it with a broken neck and a noose. And I'll just leave it there. But that ending would be absolutely iconic in Creepshow. Now, if you nail that narrative style, I think this would be a fun one, right? This is a bit of an experiment to do, but because Tales from the Crypt was able to do it, and Creepshow tried to do it with episodes like The Finger, breaking the fourth wall and talking to the audience, they should try it again with Shadow Bob. Try it again. I mean, you're not paying Theodore Sturgeon to use the story. This is public domain. Try it out here. Try it out here. I think this is a great story to do so. All right. So, yep, that's the hypothetical fifth movie. And now we're moving into the final movie, so to speak, here. And this is the final four segments that I have on this list. So, my number 9 is actually a comic. It comes from a lesser-known comic book called Creature Features. It was made by the same press that put out The Real Thing by Nancy Collins. And I feel like putting these two stories into Creepshow is fine by me because I don't see Creepshow double-dipping with their own comic stories. And because this publisher has been long out of publishing, bringing these into the franchise would be fun. And the one story that I think would be the most worthy is a complete batshit story written by Kenneth Huey called Inside Out. Inside Out is just a fun fucking story, man. So it's essentially Star Trek. Imagine like if the Star Trek crew found this alien planet, right? And they're testing out this beam that they recently got added onto the ship to beam up some life into it. But the life they beam up into it is essentially a omnipotent collective being that has gone around the universe, or I guess the galaxy that they're in, pretty much hive mind collecting species after species after species, right? And once this being comes in and he's beamed up, they realize that this being, because he's absorbed all this mental power, has these superpowers, and is starting to make the ship malfunction. And the crew starts to panic, and one by one, they fall to various abilities of this alien creature that has come aboard. And the last remaining one, the female of the story, comes to grips with the reality that she's faced, that because she's human, she can't necessarily put a stop to this threat. And maybe the mission involved has a more ambivalent purpose than being a bad thing, right? Up front, the story is essentially, if it had any subtext to it, it's about hive mind nature. It's about living in a collective bubble. It's about being happy versus having your own free will. Like, it makes you think, would you rather live a life where you're happy but you have no control over anything? Or would you rather live a life where you have free will and you're able to make hard decisions and be unhappy, right? You wouldn't think that that's in this story, but it's in here. And the fate of humanity and the weight of all that comes into fruition. Plus, I'm gonna show you an image of one of the characters that gets impacted by this alien creature in the story. I think Greg Nicotero, if you're watching and you look at this, you would love this, and you're gonna be like, "Yeah, I'm sold. Let's go ahead and make this." Trust me, this would be a fan favorite story. I feel this would be so much fun, and I'm just giddy thinking about the possibilities. Especially just thinking about the final panel being the end note of the story would be absolutely haunting. Absolutely haunting. Moving on to number 10. Now, number 10 is actually a remake. Yes, a remake. Before you get all up in arms about remakes, blah, blah, blah. I brought up earlier Robert Bloch's Mannequins of Horror from Monsters. That episode was a remake from a story from the Asylum anthology movie from the 70s. Tales from the Crypt remade and All Through the House in the TV show, which was a segment in the Tales from the Crypt movie from the 70s. There's a segment from Trilogy of Terror 2 called Bobby that was a remake of a straight-to-TV movie, I think from the 60s or 70s, called Dead of Night. That's a remake. I mean, Lot 249 from Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, got remade recently in an Arthur Conan Doyle anthology show. Twilight Zone even has remade Nightmare at 20,000 Feet and It's a Good Life like 3 times over already. It happens. It happens. But there's one story that I feel like I would remake from a different show or movie into Creepshow, and it involves a writer named Robert McCammon. And the only reason why I'm going to go ahead and fully endorse this is because Greg Nicotero is actually working on developing McCammon's most famous novel, Swan Song, into a TV show. Because Nicotero and McCammon have that connection now, I feel like bringing this story, which was originally made in 80s Twilight Zone, into Creepshow is going to be a thing. And I'm going to go ahead and say number 10 is Nightcrawlers. If you haven't seen the classic 80s Twilight Zone episode, which is easily my favorite episode from that show, you're missing out. But I think what Creepshow can do is actually honor the source material better here and make it a worthwhile remake. Because while Twilight Zone's episode is fantastic, the one thing that it's missing is the element of the monsters of the story. So this one is about a diner who has a mysterious visitor who is a war veteran who, I guess, went through some experimental drugs or had something happen to him accidentally during the war that caused him to develop powers where he can manifest stuff out of thin air with his mind. And when he goes to sleep, his nightmares literally come to life in the real world, affecting people around him. And he's basically gone a long time without sleep. He's on the run from the police, and he's asking for a night in because it's really rainy out. And once he gets wind that there's a cop there catching wind on him, he tries to leave, but the cop decides to mess around with him. They get into a skirmish, and the guy gets knocked out. And in his nightmares, there is a thing you learn before he gets knocked out, I should say, about something that he did to his fellow comrades in war. And let's just say the things from his nightmares are essentially what he did to his comrades come to full realization, but these creatures are made of mud. They have like green goop, stuff like that, and supernatural weapons. And the diner's pretty much fucked. Yeah, this is a wild one. There's a lot to peel back with the element of PTSD of war in this story. It's basically in your face the whole time about it. And it's also a really harrowing story about, admitting that you've done evil and admitting that these things are something you have to live with, and no matter how long you run away from it, no longer how much you try to fight it, it's going to come back to you. It's going to eat you alive, quite literally in this case. And it's a poetic story. A lot of people who have read the Nightcrawler story understand it's a masterpiece. A lot of people who have seen the 80s Twilight Zone episode understand its greatness. I have nothing else to say. I think it would be a fantastic Creepshow segment. So, which brings me to my last two. And my last two, I wanted to pick stories from comic book writers that have decided to branch out into Prouse storytelling. Via short stories, of course. And one story I found is actually from a rock and roll anthology book that's horror, of course. And it's written by Peter David, who is a prolific comic book writer for Marvel Comics. And co-written by Bill Mumy, who is the boy from It's a Good Life. The original, 1960s Twilight Zone episode, It's a Good Life. Bill Mumy himself co-wrote this with Peter David. And it's called The Black 59. The Black 59 is a haunting story. It's about a guitarist in a rock and roll band who is essentially in the prime of his life. He's enjoying doing his touring. He's enjoying making music. But recently, he's discovered that this guitar that he's been playing on his whole career is starting to, he's starting to express interest that he wants a new guitar. He wants something different. He's starting to blame his shortcomings that he's starting to notice on the equipment. But once he starts to try to gain some independence from this said guitar, he realizes that there's a connection that he cannot explain to this thing. And it perhaps starts to get worse as the story goes along, as he starts to realize that this guitar might be haunted with the soul of another musician that has essentially possessed this guy all these years. And the story delves into a complete batshit territory near the end, where it pulls, if you've ever seen the movie Idle Hands, you already know where the direction I'm going with here when I say this, but you do not see how the climax plays out at all, and I do not want to spoil any of that. And then the ending is pretty chilling, given the circumstances that what the character just went through, and perhaps what's still around and who's still lingering around. It is out there, but it's fun. I think this will be a fun story, about talent, about like, you can kind of think that did this musician actually ever have talent, or was it the person possessing him giving him his talent the whole time, right? And even the character thinks on that in the story at times, and it's very thought-provoking in that nature. The schlock value is fun. The split personalities in the story is fun. I think some added elements you can kind of throw in there is maybe the soul of the individual coming more into focus in the story sooner, and maybe making him actually like a visible threat in the story, and instead of like an interpretive like personality switch kind of thing going on in the character. But if you did that, I think the story would be fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Nothing else to say there. Which brings me to my last story. And this story is written by Bruce Jones, who I mentioned earlier. He's had quite a few things done with Greg Nicotero over time. There's a story in Masters of Horror called Jennifer, which is probably his most famous story he's ever written. It's considered like the best Bronze Age comic story of all time. That got adapted to Masters of Horror. And then Bruce Jones had his second best story, I think, called All Hallows, turned into a season 1 episode in Creepshow season 1. And that the episode was called All Hallows Eve, but it's essentially his comic story. This one is not a comic story by Bruce Jones, believe it or not. This is actually a Prowse short story that he wrote that never got turned into a comic. And it's called The Hollow. And The Hollow is pretty just straightforward Tales from the Crypt schlock. And it's probably the most shocking story that you're going to find on this list. But I think Creepshow could pull it off. The story is about this man. You know, he works a normal job, has a normal life. One day he realizes he's unhappy. And he decides to go to his hometown, akin to stories that you would find in Twilight Zone almost. And you kind of think that's where the story is going. But when he goes to his hometown, he starts to reconnect to his past a bit. He starts to remember his childhood crush, his childhood bully, and more importantly, this wooded area called the Hollow that was rumored to have this cannibalistic hermit guy that, I don't know, looked like a fucked up version of Tarzan that was said to eat kids if they got too close to the woods. And he starts getting these memories and these emotions flooding back to him once he starts to meet people from his childhood, and he runs into his childhood crush, runs into his childhood bully. He sees the Hollow, and he's starting to think that maybe, just maybe, there could be a shot with him getting a new lease on life with his childhood crush, because for some reason he's always held on all these years, this love and this connection to this girl. And he starts to put all of his eggs in one basket. He starts to follow her around. He finally gets to meet her, gets to catch up with her. Eventually they kind of have an affair of sorts. But there's a bombshell revealed to him about her being involved with a certain person that we learned of in the story. And this just mentally breaks this guy. And he runs out into the woods of the Hollow. And then once we get caught up to speed after a certain undisclosed amount of time, after he's went into the Hollow, there's a twist that happens. Now, the story sadly ends before we get to see what happens, but it's implied that something in the woods has changed this man, and now he's out, I guess, for some sustenance. What I think would be ironic is to incorporate a certain character that this character hates in the story to be the object of finding at the end, and I'll just leave it there. You can pick up what I'm putting down here. With that Creepshow stinger ending, seeing what this man has turned into by being in the woods would be terrifying. It would be shocking. And yes, there are some cannibal notes in here. I'll just leave it there. Yeah, there's nothing to say about this one other than, you know, this is like a metamorphosis story. This is a story about clinging onto your past, kind of outliving your prime, reconnecting to your roots, regrets in life. There's lots of stuff to peel back with the story. But like I said, there's a shocking element to this story that you just can't find anywhere else unless you're reading Bruce Jones. I mean, there was another story that I think had a shocking element like this that wasn't from Bruce Jones. It was a story by Rick Otala called Goblin Boy, and I went back and forth with this one or Goblin Boy, which one I wanted to adapt. But I went with this one because I feel like the story has more to offer, and it's less of a ripoff of something already popular. You know what I mean? So I figured, you know, this feels like a shoe-in comic story. It's almost tailor-made for Tales from the Crypt, to be honest. But Creepshow taking it, I think, would be fun. And, you know, who knows? The reception to this one, I think this, out of all these stories, if there was going to be a controversial one, it would be this one. But I think it's kind of worth throwing the bait out there to see what happens with it. So yeah, those are the 12 stories that I suggest Creepshow should adapt for movies. It should be also said, if you're a diehard Creepshow fan, the unmade Marilyn Manson segment that has never been, or I shouldn't say unmade, the unreleased Marilyn Manson segment that hasn't been put into anything, I would also welcome with open arms to be put into movies if they wanted to incorporate that into the first one when they come back. By all means, do that too. But yeah, that's where I'm at. Those are the stories I suggested. Let me know down in the comment section if you have any stories that you feel would work great in Creepshow movies. Did you like my selections? Did you not like them? Are there any stories from other shows or movies you want to remake too? Let's keep the conversation going. I love talking about this. And producers, especially Greg Nicotero and John Harrison, specifically you two, if you're out there watching, by all means, you don't have to give me credit or anything if you decide to pick some of these stories, but I'd be jonesy if you just picked one of these. And this is me just being wishfully thinking on the subject. So until next time, y'all, take care.